60 knots.
Check.
V1, rotate.
Are the mics on?
The mics are on.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 17 of the Blue Skies podcast. We are your hosts, Trisha and Aryan. I'm actually very excited to say that it's episode 17, which means we're getting close to 20. Today, we have a very special guest, one of our mentors on the board of directors with the Northern Lights Aero Foundation, Kathleen Fox. You've had a very long and diverse career across aviation and transportation safety in Canada. From flying and instructing to leadership, investigation work, you have a very impressive background. So we're excited to learn a little more about what has led you here today. So thank you for joining us, Kathy.
And thank you for having me.
So again, you've had a very unique career path. If you could walk us through where you started initially in aviation and where you are now with all the positions you might have held in between.
Certainly. So I always wanted to learn to fly. From the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I used to climb trees in the back of my house and pretend I was flying a helicopter for some reason. And as a teenager, I grew up in the era of manned space flight. I used to watch a lot of movies with fighter pilots. So early on, I decided I either wanted to be a fighter pilot or an astronaut. When I was 16, I'd earned enough money to get my private pilot's license, but I also wanted to go to university and I couldn't afford both. So I put my flying dreams on hold, went to university, and while there, I saw an ad for skydiving. And I thought, well, that's one way of getting up in the air and it's a lot less expensive. So I took up skydiving. I did that for about 12 years. And when I graduated from university, I still wanted to learn to fly. So I went to the Royal Canadian Air Force Recruiting Center in Montreal, where I was living at the time. But in those days, they weren't training women as pilots. They said, you can be a nurse, a dietitian, or an aeronautical engineer. And I said, thanks, but no thanks, I want to fly. So some of my friends had gone on to Transport Canada as air traffic controllers. And so I became an air traffic controller in the Quebec region. Worked over the next 18 years in a number of different control towers. At that point, I had the money and the time to learn to fly. So I finally did learn to fly while I was working as a controller up in Sept-Îles. So I kind of summarized that part of my career as saying that I jumped out of airplanes, I controlled airplanes, and I flew airplanes. So I had a parallel career really as an air traffic controller, initially with Transport Canada. And then in 1996, the air navigation system was privatized and I went to NAV CANADA. Mm-hmm. And I had spent 18 years, almost 18 years as an operational controller, but I wanted to go into management. So I assumed a number of management positions at NAV CANADA, culminating as Vice President of Operations, from which I retired in 2007. And then I was appointed to the Transportation Safety Board as a board member, initially part-time, and then as a full-time board member and its chair in 2014, which until 2024, so the last 10 years of my career. But all during that time, as I was either a controller or a manager or at the TSB, I continued to fly. So I taught flying for 43 years, all levels from ab initio to instructor. I also had a company for about 10 years where we did air taxi and medevacs, and I instructed there. And then when I moved to the Ottawa-Gatineau area to go to Transport Canada headquarters, I continued teaching at the Flying Club in that area. So really, I've had the opportunity to see aviation from multiple sides. As I said, literally from jumping out of airplanes to controlling airplanes to flying them to investigating when they crash.
Right. What was that initial switch to going to air traffic controller like for you? Were you ever regretful during that decision?
Never. As I said, there's a part of me that from a young age wanted to be a pilot.
Right.
And when that door wasn't open for me, I had to find another opportunity. And I thought air traffic control would be a way to stay connected to aviation and close to the airplanes that I longed to fly. And it was a great career initially with Transport Canada and then with NAV CANADA. I got an opportunity to work at a number of different airports. I got to control a number of different aircraft, including the Concorde when it was flying. So I really enjoyed that, but it also gave me because of the shift work and the pay and benefits, it also gave me the opportunity to, as I say, to have a parallel career as a pilot. And even though I never got to fly for the airlines, I did have my own company. I got to fly a turboprop aircraft doing medevacs. So no, I think, in hindsight, given the opportunities that were available to me at the time, air traffic control was a great opportunity, was a great option. And I'm very happy that I had that chance.
Good.
Mm-hmm. Do Do you have any aviation that runs in the family, or was this bug with you at a young age just because of the way the world was at that time?
So that's an interesting question because, in fact, my mother had three older brothers, and her oldest brother was a glider pilot. In fact, he built a glider. They were born in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and my uncle built a glider in like 1928.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he and his brothers flew these gliders. And tragically, one of the youngest brother of the three was killed in a gliding accident at the age of 22 rather. So you can appreciate that my mother was not very happy when she found out that her youngest daughter wanted to take up flying. But later on in life, I met other relatives from my mother's side of the family who had also gone into flying. Like one's a pilot for Air Canada. But so I think somehow the love of aviation, the bug for flying, was almost genetic because there were a number of people in the family that did it.
And when you studied at university, what was it that you studied?
Well, again, because I wanted to be an astronaut, I went in with the idea of studying physics and math. And I ended up doing mainly math and computer science, but I ended up with a Bachelor of Science degree when I graduated. So that was helpful in terms of even the air traffic control training that I did, because it involves a lot of mental math and mental projection and visualization of where traffic is. But I always enjoyed science, and one of my hobbies growing up, in addition to loving aviation, was astronomy.
Well,
I see.
back then, looking at the aviation career, pilot career, I know today an undergraduate degree isn't a necessity to get into the airlines if that is your dream. Was that so back then for becoming a pilot? Did you need a degree?
No, you didn't need a degree to become a pilot. You took the normal private pilot's license, commercial pilot's license, and then branched off, whether it was bush flying or instructing or maybe flying for an air taxi operator. However, I always recommended to people that if they could get a university degree in whatever subject, it's always good, especially if they aspire to do something else besides flying. Or in my case, I really loved being an air traffic controller. I loved the work environment. The shift work is difficult, but on the other hand, it gave me a lot more free time to pursue my other interests in aviation and flying. But I knew I didn't want to do it forever. And so having a degree, and while I was controller, but also flying, and I had my own company, I went back to university and got a master's of business administration. So all of that really helped when it did come time to go into, or to aspire to go into management positions.
Right. Could you walk us through your first few years as an air traffic controller a little more? What were your first postings like? What was the transition from being an undergraduate student to actually working in the field?
Yeah, so of course, my university courses were one thing, and that training certainly helped me because the air traffic control training is quite rigorous. But the first 8 weeks of air traffic control training was done at the regional training school in Quebec, because I was in Quebec region. So I was in Montreal, and it was actually at what was then called Dorval Airport. Now it is Pierre Elliott Trudeau International Airport. So the first 6 to 8 weeks of basic training was in the terminal building just below the tower. And I remember I would park the car, going to the school, and I'd get out, and the first thing I'd smell is jet fuel. And I always thought, oh, that's such a lovely smell. And I'd walk towards the tower, and I'd look up at the tower, and I'd say, someday I'm going to work there. So after the basic training, I was sent to Baie-Comeau Airport for 6 weeks of on-the-job training. That was through the summer. And as somebody who'd only ever lived in big cities like Montreal or other big cities in the country, it was quite a culture shock to go to a smaller, remote area. But I was there for 6 weeks. And then I went through basic training, which was in Ottawa at the Transport Canada Training Institute at the time. And then I was sent back to Quebec to Sept-Îles. And that's where I got my initial qualification as a controller. I worked there for about 2 or 3 years. And then I transferred to Saint-Hubert Tower, which at the time was the busiest airport in Canada. Primarily training traffic, but there was also a lot of military traffic that would come in there. And then after that, I went to Dorval Tower. So I had the opportunity to work from sort of smaller, less busy airports all the way up to Montreal and to Dorval. And I really enjoyed that, again, because one, if you love airplanes, you're sitting in a tower with a 360-degree view, seeing all the aircraft. Every day is different. And so those were the postings that I did in the tower. I then took 4 years, and I was an instructor for air traffic control training at a community college in Saint-Jean near Montreal. And then I went back to the tower in Dorval in those days, by then I was realizing that, eventually I would like to go into management. And in those days, you had to, as a controller, you had to have qualified, we call it checked out, in an IFR, so an area control center. So I left Dorval in 1989, went to a Montreal Area Control Center for training there, qualified, and then that prepared me to go on later to management positions.
I see. So someone who wanted to become an air traffic controller today, could they expect to have a similar sort of training regime?
It's different today in that, and I'm not as current of exactly what NAV CANADA is doing, but essentially people coming into the air traffic control system are usually streamed, and they either go into the towers or they go into the IFR, so the area control centers.
Right.
And the training is in the region rather than centralized. It went from being done in Ottawa to being done in Cornwall for a number of years. And then they decided to do it more at the regional level. So the basic training doesn't necessarily include the on-the-job training that I got for that 6 weeks in Baie-Comeau. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more reliance on simulation because the simulators that they have available now are much more sophisticated than what was available to us, back in the sort of mid to late 70s. It's still very challenging in terms of, learning the procedures and developing the skills, phraseology, the techniques. But the training is more condensed and, as I say, more reliant on simulation before you actually get into on-the-job training.
Jumping between your air traffic controller career and then introducing your piloting career and going back and forth, what did the medical look like for that? I understand that medical requirements for the CPL or PPL level are different, but there's also the air traffic controller aspect. Were any of them accredited to one or the other?
So there was a time when I got my pilot's license. Of course, I started out with a basic Category 3 medical, but I already had a Category 2 medical as an air traffic controller. And then when I became a commercial pilot and a flight instructor, and I eventually got my airline transport pilot license, I had to have a Category 1 medical. So for a long time, I actually had 2 medicals. I had a Category 1 as a commercial pilot, and I had a Category 2 as an air traffic controller. Okay. So there are medical differences. Right. And obviously, if you're flying and you have some condition that becomes incapacitating, that can be extremely dangerous, especially if you're alone in the airplane. It's different for the air traffic controller because you're not subjected to the same physiological stresses, and you're also not working alone normally. So there are differences.
I see. And so your career seemed to have a lot of windy, twisty roads to lead you to where you are now. Out of all the different jobs that you've done in the past, what do you feel like taught you the most about yourself? What did you learn the most?
I think probably the air traffic control career, because as a child, as a teenager, I was fairly introverted and probably not all that assertive. And of course, as an air traffic controller, you're directing people, pilots, to do things. You have to be cool, calm, and collected if there's an emergency. And the training can be challenging because it's not just the classroom and the simulator training, but then you spend anywhere from several months to maybe a year with somebody standing behind you, basically watching every move you make, correcting your phraseology, kind of judging your behavior. So it takes a while to get used to that. So I think it taught me a lot in terms of, one, being more assertive, being more, developing more self-confidence so that you sound confident on the radio, and also being able to prove to people along the way multiple times that you're capable and competent to do the job.
Wow.
Do you recall what one of your first or early on emergencies panned out as? Like, how did you react in those situations? How did you feel when you went through it for the first time?
I think the one that is sort of the most memorable for me was when I was working up in Sept-Îles Tower, and we were 2 on duty that morning. It was a Sunday morning. The weather was horrible. It was an indefinite ceiling of 100 feet, zero visibility in fog. The Air Canada and Quebec Air at the time scheduled flights had been unable to land because of the weather. Anyway, we were 2 on duty, but the other controller went for a breakfast break, so I was alone. And I heard this communication on the radio, and it was a float plane pilot that had taken off a lake about 50 miles northeast where the weather was better. And he wanted to come back and land at a lake just north of the airport. but there was no way that the weather system was bad from Baie-Comeau all the way up the lower North Shore to further up. And so because he was on floats and because Sept-Îles is right on the St. Lawrence River and it's 85 miles across at that point, I basically gave him a DF, a direction finding steer, and guided him out over the water. And then I said, look, all I know is you're over water now. And so he let down in cloud and landed on floats on the St. Lawrence River, and then water taxied back in. And it wasn't just me. I mean, any controller could have done it, but that literally saved his life, because with that weather, there was nowhere he could land safely on the land, and nor would he have been able to see anything. But knowing he was out over a vast expanse of water on floats, he just had to descend slowly until he saw something and then touch down on the water. Yeah. Yeah.
So throughout your career to get where you are now, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges or setbacks you faced?
Well, as I said, as an air traffic controller, you're in training and then you're assessed usually every 6 months or so. So there's always that, performance challenge of being able to prove to people that you're safe, you're competent, and to do the job. And the job changes from one day to the next. And of course, the whole objective of air traffic control is to be safe, orderly, and expeditious. The hardest kind of training that I went through was actually when I went to Montreal Area Control Center, because I really wanted to do it in order to prepare myself to take on other responsibilities later on as a manager. And I had a very good instructor at the beginning, but as often happens partway through the training, they change instructors. They give you another one. And the one I had, he was a good controller, but he and I didn't necessarily click. And so there was a period I went through where I wasn't sure if I was going to make it. And I just kept thinking, like, I really want to make it. I think I can make it. I had a discussion with the chief of the school there, and I explained what was going on. And I said, I believe I can do this, but I'm not sure I can do it with this instructor. So they changed me instructors, and that got my confidence back. And 3 weeks later, I qualified. So to me, it was, the lesson was don't give up. If you think you can do it and you want to do it and you're willing to work hard, then, take whatever steps you need to make sure that you have the right support, including, if necessary, changing instructors.
We noticed that in the piloting career as well, right? And you being an aviation, a pilot instructor as well, that there are a lot of setbacks, and it might not be necessarily that you have an instructor that's looking to get the worst out of you. It may just be that your personalities might not click, or you're not effectively learning from this person. And so the best course of action is to change there. But I think as a student in any situation, in any field, you're very timid, right? Because you are the one that's learning. You're not experienced. And so sometimes it might be difficult to speak up in such situations. But in your case, as a prime example, making that change and stepping out of your comfort zone to speak up was obviously for the benefit.
I think what helped is by then I was already a fairly senior controller.
Yeah.
I'd worked at 4 different towers.
Right.
I was a supervisor when I left Montreal Tower to go to Montreal Center. And I was older. So I think that combination and my desire to move on to other things in management later on combined to give me the motivation to say, no, I've already devoted a year of my life or close to a year of my life. I'm really close to the end, and I'm not going to give up, and I'm not going to let the fact that maybe I don't click with this particular person, give me to somebody else and as another instructor. And if they say I'm good, I'm good. And if they say I'm not, well, then I'll accept the decision. But it all worked out in the end.
So then what advice would you give? Because you mentioned that when you were younger, you were a little more timid, right? A little more introverted. If a person like that is going through flight training and they don't have a position of seniority and they're only maybe 50 hours in, but one thing they can feel is that this instructor and them, they're not learning much. What piece of advice could you give someone in that situation?
Well, I think, first of all, whenever we learn something, and flying is certainly some people may find it easier to learn to fly than others, but I think we all have to accept that we're going to have learning plateaus, and you shouldn't be discouraged because maybe you're not as far ahead as somebody else. Give yourself some grace to get through that. But obviously the instructor plays a key role. So I think it starts by having a frank discussion with the instructor. And I think as an instructor, we have to adapt our teaching styles to help the student progress. And not everybody works the same ways. And then if that doesn't work, then escalate it, for example, to the chief flying instructor, whoever's responsible. And it's not about liking or not liking somebody. It's just we all have different communication styles. We have different learning styles, and we have different experiences. And I think that it's just best to speak up and say, look, this is what I need, especially given that most people are paying for their own training. It's a lot of money. And so just don't be afraid to speak up and say, this isn't working for me. And I think most schools are very understanding of that. They accept and will change to another instructor who's more, I guess, in sync with the student.
Yeah, one of the big things we say, and something that we were also taught, is to always advocate for yourself.
Absolutely.
And that at the end of the day, you're right. You're the one paying for your training. You're the one who's spending all this time and effort to go through it. So if something is an issue, I understand it can be difficult to speak out at times, but it is really the only right option at the end of the day. And so for yourself, when you found yourself in this position, I guess if you were earlier on in your training, in your career, I'm assuming maybe you wouldn't feel like you would have the confidence to be able to speak out if you face that sort of situation, but it built up.
Yeah, I think I mean, I didn't have any difficulties in training prior to that. Like any of the other places I'd qualified, because I qualified in Sept-Îles. I went back to Baie-Comeau for a bit, then Saint-Hubert, then Montreal. All of those places I did qualify in, which is not to say that the training was like 100% smooth all the way. I mean, you have your ups and downs, but overall, I was successful. That I felt I had the qualification. It might have been different if it had been my very first assignment, when I was sent to Sept-Îles, but I really wanted to do the job. I really liked the work. And so I think the nature of the work helped to, bring me out of myself, build confidence, build that assertiveness that helped me later on when I ran into more challenges.
Yeah, aviation does have, I feel like the entire journey is just filled with constant challenge. And I find that a lot of people I talk to who've been in this career for years and years are still sharp. There's no decline. They're motivated. They're sharp. They're still working at things. And like you're doing now, giving back to the community and finding ways to help improve the situation for others. I feel like nowadays we have a better aviation community, and there's a lot more support systems, like through the Northern Lights mentorship program. But back then, when you were doing your training, did you feel you had a community you could fall back on, or other people for support within the industry?
If we're talking about flying, certainly when I learned to fly in 1978, I had a female instructor, and I was working at the tower, so I understood that side of things. And I remember when I started to fly, I think I had maybe 16, 17 hours at the time. And the tower, the controllers would recognize my voice and the frequency, and they'd say, so Kathy, when are you going to go solo? And of course, the last thing you want is pressure from the tower. And I said, well, I'm sure my instructor will release me solo when I'm ready. And I eventually did solo within a couple of hours, but that put a little bit of extra pressure on me. When I came back to Montreal and I decided to continue flying, that's when I met up with the 99s. So that's the International Organization of Women Pilots. And even though I was from Montreal, I'd been gone for 3 years. A lot of my network had gone to other jobs, other areas of the country. And so that was an organization that I found, my people, in the sense of I found others who were interested in flying. So that was a great support network, both socially and with respect to flying. A lot of the controllers in the areas where I worked were pilots themselves. And so through those connections, that's how I ended up starting to fly at Saint-Jean, which is just south of Montreal, and where I eventually had my own company with 3 other people. And we ran a flight training school. We ran an air taxi operation doing charters and medevacs and so on. So I think the aviation community, once you're in it, sometimes maybe it seems hard to get in it, but once you're in it, it really can be quite a supportive community. And so the opportunity to have a business, the opportunity to teach flying, that all, really helped to keep me in essentially a parallel career with, it wasn't the career that put bread on the table, so to speak, but it allowed me to carry on doing that while I was also being an air traffic controller.
I see.
Can you talk us through what motivated you to want to step out of your comfort zone as a traffic controller and make the switch to NAV Canada, or expand your work and now as an honorary colonel? Were there points where you felt comfortable and you didn't want to and you had to push yourself out of your role, or were you always naturally driven to always change and strive to learn more?
As I said, probably the biggest challenge was that transition from tower controller supervisor to the area control center. And then once I qualified, I did that for about 2 years. Then the next opportunity was to come to the Ottawa area. So I was working in Montreal in an operational position. And then I received an opportunity to go to Ottawa and a desk assignment, what's the developmental position. And what was interesting about that was I had to move. It was a 3-year assignment. It was completely out of my comfort zone. In fact, I remember when you're an air traffic controller, everything is like right now. You're living in the moment. When I went into a desk job, I remember calling somebody and I needed information, and they said, well, we'll call you back next week. And I said, what do you mean next week? If I need it now. Because as a controller, if an airplane calls and they want to climb or descend, it's tell me yes or tell me no, or tell me now. And to go to a desk job where somebody says, well, I'll get back to you next week. That was a big culture change. But with respect to moving to NAV Canada, so that happened in 96. And I was always on the operational side. And when Transport Canada the government decided to privatize the air navigation system, I could have stayed at Transport Canada, but I would have been on the regulatory side. And I wanted to stay operational. Even though I was in a management position, it was still operational management. And so I and many of my colleagues transferred to NAV Canada, private company. And there was a lot of, uncertainty in that. But I just felt that was where my future lay. And over the course from 96, 97 until 2007, so 10 or 11 years, that's when I progressed from, being in a sort of basic junior management position up to executive position and finally retired as the vice president of operations. But everything I'd done up until then, all that air traffic control experience I had in the towers in the center as an instructor, the piloting experience that I had, running a company, 2 university degrees, all of that converged to prepare me to be the vice president of operations of NAV Canada. And I certainly would never regret that, because that was a tremendous opportunity and ultimately led to the next step, which was to the Transportation Safety Board.
How did your personal and social life fit in with all of these changes throughout your career?
It was hard. I had to make choices. At one point, I was working full-time at Transport Canada, working part-time as a pilot and a company owner. I went, as I said, back to university to do a master's degree. So something has to give. And certainly it gave on the personal side. I went to a conference once, and somebody asked a woman who's the speaker, can you do it all? And her answer stuck with me. She said, you can do it all, you just can't do it all at the same time. So I think in life we have to make, choices and determine our priorities. And when my family needed me, I was there. But at the same time, I was able to pursue my professional career and my flying career. But there's always one comes a little bit at the expense of the other.
Is there anything you would change about your path?
No, and I said that recently. When I started out, I wanted to be a fighter pilot or an astronaut. Well, I couldn't join the RCAF at the time because, I could have, but I wouldn't have been a pilot. And I didn't want that. So I went to Transport Canada. The space program in Canada, I actually applied in 1983 when the first Canadian astronauts were chosen, but I didn't have the credentials to compete with the people who were ultimately chosen for that. So what I say is that when some doors were closed to me, I looked for other doors that were open. And now, when I look back at my career and I think of all the things that I did, I think that if I were to go back and do it all over, I would do it exactly the same, because it turned out better than I ever could have planned. For example, I wanted to be a fighter pilot. Well, I didn't become a fighter pilot, but as vice president of operations at NAV Canada, I got to fly in an FAT as a passenger, and he let me hand fly out of Bagotville.
Wow.
And although I never was able to join the Air Force, when I retired from the Transportation Safety Board, I was appointed an honorary colonel of 412 Transport Squadron in the RCAF. So you just never know how the twists and turns, and you mentioned that earlier, because it really was. If you look at some sort of helical thing with all these different strands going through my career and my life, I wouldn't change anything, and it could not have turned out better if I planned it, because I never could have planned it this way. What I also say to people is that when I look out at younger people, or younger in the sense of in terms of their career, starting out in their career, they have so many more opportunities these days. And so it's very inspiring. And I am inspired by that generation and all the opportunities they have. And I always tell people, grab those opportunities because, they weren't available to some of us earlier on.
Right. As someone who's seen the industry in many different angles, what do you think, what qualities truly make someone successful in this industry, aviation and aerospace combined?
Well, I think you have to have a passion for the industry, regardless of what the person does, be it pilot, maintenance, air traffic controller, or even on the corporate and financial side. I think people need to have that passion for the industry because it isn't easy and it definitely has its highs and lows. But passion, commitment to the industry is one thing. I think being adaptable, because that's the one thing that helped me a lot in my career. Sometimes I didn't go up, I went sideways in my career, but it led to other opportunities that I might not have otherwise had. So I think adaptability and the willingness to continuously learn, because especially in aviation and aerospace, things are changing so rapidly, especially today with the technology. Opportunities are expanding. There's more roles for people who want to be in it.
Great.
That I think adaptability, I think having good communication skills and being willing to learn continuously are really important.
Yeah, can you talk our listeners through a day in the life of you when you were Vice President of NAV Canada or head of TSB? What does that look like?
Very different jobs and very different days. But I would say the one common thing is they were never the same. So, for example, as Vice President of NAV Canada, of operations of NAV Canada, I was responsible for the overall operation of the air traffic control system, and not just air traffic control, but flight service, as well as operational requirements, the technology requirements for controllers and so on. So a lot of interaction with stakeholders. If there were delays in one airport, for example, it could be Saturday night, I could be sitting at home on my deck in the summer, and I'd get a call from Air Canada saying, why are there delays in Toronto? It was definitely 24/7 in that job, and there were definitely a lot of pressures to deliver service, to deliver it effectively, and also at a reasonable cost, because under NAV Canada, customers are paying for the service. The difference at TSB was I was the chair of the board, but also the chief executive officer. And there's unfortunately always incidents or accidents happening, but it wasn't the same sort of 24/7 operation that I had at NAV Canada, where there's a system out there, it's operating, and we have to keep it operating, and we have to keep traffic moving safely and efficiently. So there were very different demands on it. So in terms of a standard day at the TSB, it might be, a lot of meetings, some media. I wasn't involved directly in the investigations. Those were done by investigators, but it was basically making sure that they had all the resources they needed, setting the policies for investigations, sometimes meeting with government officials, sometimes with other safety agencies, fair amount of international travel to work with our counterparts in other countries.
Great.
So very different. But again, at TSB, everything I'd done before, from jumping out of airplanes to flying to controlling to my education, the work I did at NAV Canada as Director of Safety and then as Vice President of Operations, it all converged to prepare me for that role. And I would say that, honestly, I was very fortunate and very privileged to, spend 17 years after I retired from NAV Canada doing that role, because we could see that the work we were doing was really making a difference in improving the safety of Canadians, not just in aviation, but in the other modes of transport as well, including rail and marine and even pipeline.
Out of everything that you did, what job did you enjoy the most?
Oh, that's nice. It's like asking which trial do you prefer. They all brought something. Like I wouldn't have given up any one of them. As I mentioned, I think that if I had to do it all again, I would do it all the same. I loved air traffic controlling, but I also loved being in an executive position, because when you're a controller or a pilot, as I said, you're really in the moment. You're doing a specific task. Like if you're flying, you're teaching somebody to fly, or you're flying somebody safely from A to B. If you're controlling, you're really satisfied if you can move traffic quickly, safely, and everybody's getting to where they need to go, and you're dealing with whatever weather challenges or equipment challenges may come up. when I was at, TSB, the accident investigations were actually having an impact on improving safety. So I can't say that any one I liked more than the other. I'm just very grateful that I was able to experience it all.
What changes have you seen for women in the industry throughout the years, and what do you think still needs improvement looking at it in hindsight today?
Well, I think the big change, first of all, is there are more women in more roles in aviation, from pilots to air traffic controllers to, in the maintenance world to in the executive world. So I think that's great. When I became an air traffic controller, there were about 5% of the controllers were women, and today it's around 17 to 19%.
Oh, okay.
So it's increased. Pilots are still a low number when you look at overall. But I think the main change I've seen is that there's more opportunities for women now than there were 30, 40, 50 years ago. The other thing I think is that I think it's become more normal, even for passengers to see a woman on the flight deck. So I think that's good. In terms of what needs to change, I really believe that if we want to get more people in the industry, and I'll say women in particular, we have to go back. We have to start early with kids in grade school, like in that 8 to 12 range, to expose them, to present them with the opportunities in aviation. And as I said, it's not just as pilots, it's in all of the other aviation careers. So for example, one thing that I've been doing in the Ottawa area now since 2013, and we have one coming up in a couple of weeks, we do a Girls Fly Day or Girls Take Flight Day, where we offer free rides to girls and young women in a light general aviation aircraft. And it's not necessary that they're going to learn to fly, but it piques their interest. And we have, others that come, for example, Northern Lights will come, and other groups like the Air Cadets. And it just exposes them again and presents them that, oh, I could be a pilot, or, oh, I could be a maintenance engineer, or I could be an air traffic controller. And I think it's really important to have younger kids more aware of the opportunities that exist. Like, I didn't know anything about air traffic control until some of my friends went to it. And if I hadn't known them, I'm not sure I would have ended up in that career. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that's changed, and this is kind of funny, it's not funny, but back in the days when I was a controller, one of my colleagues, female colleagues, I remember, got pregnant. And in those days, pregnancy was like a sickness, and you were immediately removed, couldn't work as an air traffic controller or as a pilot. So I think the rules have changed. I think, there's more, I think, understanding of family responsibilities. And so you see that in collective agreements, for example, whether it's maternal or paternal leave. We used to joke in the day that a father would get a day off of work for the birth of a child, but the mother didn't, because there were very, very few female controllers. So it was nothing in the collective agreement. Those are the types of things that I've seen change.
How did you get involved with the Northern Lights? You mentioned your relationship with the 99s and when you were back, but what about Northern Lights? How did they become introduced?
It happened actually when I received the LC award back in 2010. I was the second recipient of the award, and it was at a time, it was before Northern Lights. It was an initiative that had been spearheaded by the first Canadian chapter of the 99s out of Toronto area, and they wanted to find a way to recognize women. So they instituted this Elsie Award based on Elsie McGill, first female aeronautical engineer in Canada, certainly, and beyond. So that's when I got to meet a lot of the people involved at the beginning, and then that grew into the modern day Northern Lights Aero Foundation, where it's not just one woman a year being recognized, but 8 if you include rising stars to trailblazers and the various sectors of the aviation and aerospace industry. So that's how I became aware of it. And after I retired, I was approached to see if I would like to be on the board, and I was honored and flattered to be asked, because at this stage in my life, I want to be able to give back. So whether it's to Northern Lights, whether it's through presentations, conferences, I think I've learned a lot, and I hope that I can pay it forward and encourage and inspire other young women, for example, to take up careers in aviation and aerospace.
For sure. And why do you choose to give back to the community? Why not just enjoy retirement?
First of all, I worked for over 50 years in full-time employment, and in fact, holding multiple jobs at a time, if you consider that I had a parallel career with flying. But when I retired from the TSB in 2024, I said, I need three things. I said, I need intellectual stimulation, I need social engagement, and I need physical activity. So whether it's being an honorary colonel for the RCAF, or being a board director on the Northern Lights Aero Foundation, or any of the other activities I do, that gives me that intellectual stimulation and the social engagement that I want to have. And I just think it's very important to continue to learn, because I said earlier that I think continuous learning is important, and I still learn a lot from just attending conferences and being involved in these types of activities.
For young women out there listening who may feel intimidated to enter this field, what would you want them to remember about pursuing their goals in this industry?
I think it starts with, first of all, is if they're interested and they're willing to work hard, they have a place, and they belong, and nobody should stand in their way, because there's so many more opportunities now. So, as I said, I was shy, introverted, and to go into an environment where, you have to exude self-confidence and assertiveness was a challenge. But at the same time, it allowed me to pursue my other dreams of aviation. So I think find your allies, develop your support network, but it's really important to believe, I can do this. If I can do this,
Right.
They can do it. And just pursue their dreams. And you just never know. But be open to other opportunities, because you just never know where your career path is going to lead you.
I know that you're in retirement, but can you maybe reflect on what you're excited about with what's forthcoming within this industry? Any changes, things that we can look forward to for anyone that's interested in joining as an air traffic controller?
Well, I think, air traffic is growing. People want to travel. There's opportunities as air traffic controllers. The technology is changing so much. In my day, we had pieces of paper. We wrote aircraft idents and types on there. And now the technology is so much different, both in terms of flight data, radar, or other forms of surveillance. So it's a great career, and somebody can join as an air traffic controller, but then after a certain period of time, they can spin into other opportunities, whether it's developing procedures or developing technology or teaching or investigating incidents and issues with air traffic control. So I think, for example, air traffic control in particular, and with NAV Canada as the major employer in Canada, it is one area where you can still have a career with the same company. And that's not always the case these days. A lot of people tend to move from company to company or from operator to operator, and that's fine if that's what they want to do. But I think for air traffic control, there's just so much opportunity, so many possibilities. It's a great career, great salary, great benefits, and the opportunity to do a lot of other things, including working internationally. And I don't mean as an air traffic controller, but just that kind of expertise is desired in other countries where they are developing or improving, modernizing their system.
Quick question. Does Canada have a relatively safe kind of air traffic control system compared internationally?
Yeah, there's no... it's hard to benchmark, but certainly I would put Canada's air traffic control system up against any other air traffic control system in the world. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it was privatized, because up until 1996, it was operated by government. But there were a lot of challenges, given budget cutbacks. They weren't able to staff up. They weren't able to develop new technology. Governments have a harder time sometimes developing new technology because of all the rules and regulations. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just saying that's the nature of government. So by privatizing the air navigation system in Canada, it allowed more capital investment, which allowed the operator to develop more in terms of staffing, technology, and modernization. And I think compares, favorably to any organization anywhere else in the world. So I certainly have no qualms getting on an aircraft in this country and going anywhere in terms of air traffic control. I know they're facing challenges now because of short staffing, and that short staffing causes delays. But that's the safe thing to do. If you don't have the staff, then you have to reduce the traffic flow to what can be handled with the staff that you have. that is unfortunately a byproduct of the pandemic and the precipitous drop in commercial air traffic during that period, where they had to take steps to, cut back because they just didn't have the income. But that being said, no, I think it's, as I said, I have no qualms. I think NAV Canada is coming up on its 30th anniversary. It's hard to believe, in November. But I think it's done a great job. But obviously they still have challenges, particularly on the staffing side to address.
Well, in our very short span of being in this industry, we've also seen just the potential for someone that's entering that field or that job specifically. And as pilots, I think we look up to what they do in their role and how much they have to endure. And if you are a student pilot out there and there's a way for you to set up an opportunity with your flight school to maybe check out a tower or visit a NAV Canada building and maybe speak to them a little more, maybe it is a career that might interest you. And you could parallel just like Kathy did. But we're also excited to see what changes happen. You're right, technology is ever evolving, and I believe there's more incentives for the newer generations to join such a career. So we're excited to see how that pans out in the next few years.
As well, I'll certainly be watching.
Yeah.
Aside from that, we wanted to give you a huge thank you for joining us today, sharing your experience, your lessons. I think there was at least 5 important lessons that I picked up from this one. And yet I feel like we barely scratched the surface, and your career is so deep.
And hopefully just to the young women that are out there to see and reflect on what it was one day for a woman to join, to what women like you, Kathy, have done to pave such a welcoming pathway for women in aviation and aerospace today. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for shedding a little more light on what you went through.
Well, thanks very much for having me, and all the best to you in your future careers and endeavors with the podcast and whatever else that you get involved with. So thank you.
Thank you.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us for episode 17. Wishing all of you blue skies and tailwinds ahead. We'll catch you next time.